to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is the host of the Wrong Place, Right Crime podcast and the author of dozens of novels, most of which are in the crime fiction genre. His name is Frank Zafiro, and here's my interview with Frank. Frank Zafiro, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Well, thanks for having me.
Why did you choose the pen name Frank Zafiro?
Well, I was an active law enforcement officer when my first fiction was being published. Well, that's not entirely true. I had a couple things published earlier, but that's when I first started getting serious about publishing short stories and had a book I was working on, and I needed a little distance, I think, from the artist and the officer. And so I took a pen name, changed Spokane to River City with a couple of tweaks to make it different, but not many. And then basically I had that distance at that point. You know, I had a pen name, I had a different city. I could be vague in my bio and say I was a law enforcement officer in the Pacific Northwest, that sort of thing. And it kind of provided me a little bit of cushion there in case my bosses didn't like what I was writing.
You've feel free to further introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, that's a pretty good starter. I was a law enforcement officer for 20 years. Did a lot of the different things that you do as a line officer before moving into leadership roles in the second half of my career. And that's where I commanded every part that I never did as a line officer. So I got a pretty good overview, both depth and breadth of police operations. My first book was published in 2006. Over 50 books out now. Most of them are crime fiction under this pen name, Frank Zafiro. And a fair number of those are what I would call police procedurals. So they follow the police officers, and it's a lot more about the process than necessarily the mystery, although there's the mystery is an element as well. Beyond that, I was in the military for a little while when I was growing up. As an 18-year-old, I went in for 5 years. And since retiring in 2013, I've done some teaching and consulting, but mostly been focused on writing full time.
You've written a mid-two-figure number of novels, so around or over 50, many of which are crime fiction novels in the River City series, whose setting is based on, but not exactly identical to Spokane, Washington, and the eastern part of that state. And the Stefan Kopriva Mysteries series. Did I pronounce the name of that series correctly?
Pretty close. Stefan Kopriva.
Kopriva, okay.
Closer than most people get, though.
Without spoiling too much of both series, what are both series about, and what are a few books from each series about?
Well, the River City series follows a core group of officers and detectives as they deal with the vagaries of police work, essentially. Each book has kind of a central problem or situation to be dealt with. Usually, obviously, it's some kind of a crime or ongoing crime. And that's the focus, but you also get to know these characters over time. And since, about 15 years has passed within the universe of River City, in the books to date, you get to see people go from being a young officer to a veteran and, progress in their life and their career. Some examples of the kind of crimes I'm talking about. The first one, Under a Raging Moon, has a serial robber who's hitting convenience stores and getting progressively more violent. And the patrol officers are trying to stop him before it goes too far. That book focuses almost exclusively on patrol with uniformed officers, which is not as common. Usually detectives get to be the main, source of point of view, and they get the most screen time, both in shows and in books of this kind, crime fiction. But I was a patrol officer when I wrote that, and I wanted to focus on patrol. And so, and the series does throughout. The patrol never becomes, like a bit player, but I do introduce detectives and even leaders in the organization to flesh out the storylines. Second book has a kidnapping. Third book has a serial rapist. Fourth book has a gang war. Fifth book has some white supremacists who are doing push-in home robberies. And the sixth book has a school shooting. And the seventh book has a serial killer at work. So you can see it's kind of a wide range of events going on. And through it all, you get to see the process by which the police deal with it, but you also get to know the cops as individuals. One of my goals in writing this pretty early on was to really humanize the police officers and show them as individuals who were, flawed, but also generally good, and who are trying to do their best at a very difficult job. So it's one of those things where if they may make mistakes, but they're not malicious mistakes. That was important to me because I think it's a misunderstood profession in some regard, and a lot of fiction you read either goes, I think, too far one way or the other. Either the cops are essentially superheroes without capes, or they're the most corrupt individuals on the planet. And I kind of wanted to strike a realistic but positive stance on who the cops are. They're the good guys. They don't always win, and never without a cost when they do. But their intents are generally noble. The Stefan Kopriva series is a spin-off series. Kopriva was a police officer, and this is a mild spoiler, but at some point in the main series, he does leave the job, and this is a first-person private investigator sort of series that picks up 10 years after he's left the job, and he has a pretty big event that occurred that he's still reeling from, feeling a lot of guilt. I think most people would agree he deserves to feel guilty for it. It was a big mistake. And the first book, Waist Deep, like I said, is 10 years after he leaves the job, and it's more of a redemption arc. Him trying to find a way to redeem himself, maybe forgive himself at least enough to live a real life, and that's a long and torturous process. So that in this first book, he's not a private investigator. He's just kind of pulling himself up out of having recently been dealing with some addiction issues, and he comes across not even a friend, more of an acquaintance from high school, who remembers that he had been a cop and asks him to help find his runaway teenage daughter. And so he's kind of an unlicensed PI of sorts in this first book, and he tries to do so. And of course, there's a parallel. If he can save this one, maybe that makes up for the one he didn't save, and that sort of thing is going on for sure. In later books, he actually ends up working for a defense attorney as an investigator, and kind of puts his life together a little bit. But one of my friends once said Kopriva is kind of my whipping boy, and that's not entirely untrue. He has taken a lot of abuse over the series, both series actually.
What are some other crime fiction novels and series of novels that you've written?
I write a series that's kind of the flip side of River City in a way. It's called the Spokompton series. And this is a series that instead of focusing on law enforcement, it actually focuses on the criminal side of things. It's in a different universe. It's not in the same world as River City. But this one has a different narrator each book, but it's a consistent world. So you might come across characters, in the fourth book that you are already familiar with, but it won't be their POV. You'll have a new point of view. And in this one, I just like to explore kind of the underside, the flip side of that badge, the gritty underworld, the criminal underworld. And I started this series considerably later than the River City series. I don't think I wrote the first one until 2010 or 2011, and I'd been that, it's a good 7, 8 years after I started writing River City Stories. And so at first it was just, this would be fun, to write a different kind of book from a different perspective. But I kind of got to the point where I wanted to kind of do the same thing with these characters as I did with the police characters in River City, and that was to, not show them as a caricature or as a typical, cliched bad guy, but try to get to the very human element of who they were. And so that's what I've tried to do there. Um, the first one is called At Their Own Game, and it is actually about a guy who was a cop briefly and got bounced off the job in a way that doesn't appear to be very fair. And he's decided to make a living as a fence, as someone who deals in stolen property, kind of uses his knowledge of how the system works to fly below the radar. And so basically he's beating them at their own game. That's where the title comes from. And everything's going fine for him. Not rich or anything, but he's getting by, has a 2-man crew. Things are not going bad. And then he decides to stretch a little bit and do a drug deal. And then everything kind of goes bad from there. And then, of course, it's noir, hard boiled. So there has to be a femme fatale. And there is a woman from his past comes into his life at the same time to complicate matters. And things just keep swirling down the drain from there for Jake. So that's one series. Hard boiled wise, I wrote a series with Jim Wilski. We co-wrote it called the Anya series, and that is a series of 4 books. Each one has 2 protagonists, and they're written one by me and one by Jim. And they're in the first person with alternating chapters. So you get the viewpoints of both of these characters in a very intimate way. And they are, dealing with different situations, dealing with different criminal situations. But the through thread of all 4 books is a femme fatale named Anya. And she is kind of mysterious because you only get her point of view maybe 3 or 4 times through the entire series. But she's the kind of woman who has an effect on men, let's just say. And she's smart. And so she kind of plays these men in each book to varying degrees. The first book's called Blood on Blood. And in Blood on Blood, a pair of half brothers go to their dad's prison deathbed, and he tells them about a score that he did where there were some diamonds stolen and not all of them were recovered. And he kind of sends them on a quest essentially to get these missing diamonds. And it's kind of a Cain and Abel meets the Hardy Boys kind of situation. And they work together, but also against each other because they hate each other as they try to find these diamonds. And then, of course, Anya enters the picture and things get even more complicated. That was a fun series. It is what I would call a closed series, meaning that it's over, it's done. There's 4 books and that's it. The other series I've mentioned so far are open-ended. They continue. I wrote a series with Eric Beetner, a fantastic writer down in Southern California who writes some of the fastest reading passages you're ever going to find. And I talked him into collaborating on a series that we call the Bricks and Cam Jobs. And these feature a pair of hitmen, Bricks and Cam. And I write Bricks and he writes Cam. Same scenario. We alternate the chapters in the first person. And in the first one, the backlist, we meet them both. They don't know each other yet, as the mob is having to downsize. And so they're going to be laying off some hitmen essentially. And they put together a couple of lists of outstanding accounts that need to be settled. And the idea is that whoever does a better job or gets done first is going to keep their position. And the other one's probably going to find themselves at the unemployment line. What that looks like for the mob, I don't know. Could be cement shoes. But anyway, I would call it, there's some comedy in there, but it's not intentionally. It's dark comedy. It's more of an action sort of story. But definitely there's some dark comedy in there. And Eric writes some pretty good gross out scenes too. He wins the gross out prize in all three books. That's also pretty much a closed series. We ended it. I don't know if we'll go back and explore it anymore. We might. It's they're compelling characters, but we left them in a good spot to end it too. So that could be all. Let's see. I write another private investigator series, the Jack McCrae Mysteries. There's only two of those right now. There'll be a third one for sure. That might be the last one though, and that features a guy named Jack McCrae who is retired as a detective, and he was never, a superstar detective. He was kind of just an average detective, never had a huge case, that sort of thing. And he doesn't have any family. He's kind of a lonely guy, and he is approached by the daughter of a woman that he lived with a long time ago, about 30 years ago. And she has discovered that after her mother died, she figured out that she might have a much younger sister. And the early twist is they do some math and figure that it could even be this guy's daughter, perhaps. And she wants to team up with him and get some help finding this younger sister. But the problem is that they grew up in a small town in Oregon that has kind of a prominent family with an iron fist over things, and so it isn't as easy as just bopping on down to the courthouse or talking to a few people. And so he goes on that adventure with her, and that's the first in the McCrae novels there. I feel like I'm leaving one out, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I don't have my website up. I'm probably forgetting my favorite one or something. That's the way these things tend to go.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. What is your writing routine like if you have one?
I sort of have one. I mean, I get up in the morning, grab coffee, and come in here and pick up wherever I'm at from the previous day. I have some friends who have a very strict routine. Like probably my closest writing partner, he writes new words in the morning and edits in the evening, and he's got a day job in between. I tried that for a while. It didn't work for me. I tried a bunch of different schedules once I had the latitude to do so, because I was home and retired. And what I discovered works best for me is to just to work for a few hours in the morning on whatever needs to be done, whether that's new words or editing. Or this morning I worked on some plotting for the next River City novel, the outline. And I might go 2-3 hours in the morning, and that's it. I might go all day. It's always been sort of flexible for me, and I think that was born out of when I was still working. I kind of had to steal time where I had it. And if I had an hour, I had an hour. If I had a whole day for some reason, I'd go the whole day because I didn't know when I'd get the next hour. And so I think it's one of those things that's almost become a habit in a way. I'm sure I could be more effective if I had a more regimented routine, but then again, I'm working for myself, so I don't necessarily have to be more effective.
Are all your books self-published, traditionally published, published via hybrid press, or did you use different publishing methods for your books?
Well, historically, I've done all three in the past, and that's a long and winding story that I won't bore you with now. But at present, I reached a point where I decided I wanted to be 100% independently published, and so I publish all of my own work. The only thing, with one exception, I have a series that I created and edit and have a few entries in that I wrote called A Grifter's Song. And that's a 35 book, each book's a novella, but 35 part or chapter story of Sam and Rachel, who are grifters. And they love two things. They love each other and the game. And each outing, each episode is a standalone and has a con in it that is resolved in each episode, so they can all be read individually, and often are. But there's also a series arc that takes place if you read from 1 to 35. And so that was published initially at Down and Out Books and is still there. But that's the only thing I've got that's published anywhere aside from having stories and anthologies here and there. Other than that, 98% of my work is published under my own banner.
What drew you to writing crime fiction? Was it your real life law enforcement career, something else, or a combination thereof?
Yeah, I think it was being in the career when I hit a time where I was writing fiction again. I went through a good 8-year period where I wasn't writing any crime fiction or any fiction whatsoever because I was learning new jobs on the job constantly, and I was going back to school for my undergraduate degree. So I was reading a lot of history books and writing a lot of history papers and doing a lot of police reports and doing a lot of writing, but none of it, fiction, because I didn't really have the time. And so that was about an 8-year period. And around about 2004, when I started getting back to fiction again, it was crime fiction that came out because that was what was on my mind. All these, experiences that I was having spurred ideas. And so it's only been in the last few years where I've actually started to branch out and write some mainstream stuff under a different name and some fantasy and science fiction under a third pen name, which is kind of going back to the beginning because that's what I grew up on was fantasy and sci-fi. And some of my earliest attempts at writing were in those genres.
One final question. You host the Wrong Place, Right Crime, that's WRITE, podcast. What can listeners expect from a typical episode of your podcast?
I guess one of two things, because there are two different types of episodes. One is a shorter episode, and one's a much deeper dive. Maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes for the shorter ones, and up to an hour and a half for the longer ones. But in both cases, it's going to most of the time be a crime fiction author, perhaps somebody famous that I've had Walter Mosley on and Steve Hamilton and Meg Gardner, or somebody you may never have heard of who this is their first book, or they're a short story author who writes crime fiction in that form. And we talk about them as a person, and then we talk about their work. And the whole purpose really is to promote other crime fiction authors and to help, maybe a prospective reader finding a new author to read. Kind of sometimes we'll say, listen in, you might find your next favorite author, that sort of approach. And it's been great because as you well know, you make friendships with many of the guests and I run into them at the conferences and so forth. And so a lot of friendships have started as a result of having people on the show. And it's a good feeling to promote other people and to just, and I always discover things that I didn't know about the person that I find interesting too. So I'm up over 180 episodes now. Probably be about 6 episodes this year. I'm kind of ratcheting back a little bit because, as you probably know this as well, it's a very time-consuming endeavor, and it was taking a little bit too much away from my writing time. But I loved it and wanted to keep doing it, so I had to kind of find a happy medium. And about 6 episodes a year right now seems to be where it's at. But I might increase it in the future, or who knows.
Frank, I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You were an amazing guest.
Oh, you're very kind. I really appreciate you having me on.
Frank is, to my knowledge, the first guest who has given me a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet listing his catalog of books, which greatly helped me in preparing this interview, and Frank was a wonderful guest to interview. Unfortunately, there is some sad news in the publishing world that I must acknowledge. Sue Arroyo, the founder and publisher of the independent book publisher Camcat Books, died recently. I offer my condolences to Sue, her family, her friends, her loved ones, and the authors she worked with. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@ApolloPapyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.